They closed the door before I even said a word. Not slammed, just quietly, like I was a mistake they hoped would walk away on its own. I stood there holding a pie I baked by hand, the kind my grandson used to beg for, and listened to laughter on the other side of the wall. My name wasn't mentioned. My seat wasn't set. I wasn't expected. That's where this begins. Not with a fight, not with shouting, but with silence sharp enough to cut through years of sacrifice. What followed wasn't anger. It was something colder, something final. If you've ever felt the sting of being quietly erased, you'll understand. Stick around, like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to hear your story too. I showed up at my son's door on Christmas Eve, holding a homemade pie and a small gift for my grandson. My daughter-in-law cracked the door and called back inside. "Didn't you tell him we were busy?" My son appeared, half guilty, half indifferent. "I didn't think you'd actually come, Dad." No invite, no warmth. I turned, walked back to my truck, and later that night, I canceled the mortgage payments I've been making on their house for the past 6 years. My name is Walter Grant. I'm 72 years old and live alone in a modest home on the outskirts of Galveston, Texas. I used to be an aircraft mechanic before I retired 15 years ago. My wife, Mary, passed away 7 years back, right around Christmas, and since then, I've made it a point to stay connected with our only son, Kyle. He was a bright kid, maybe too much for his own good, and I always try to give him what I never had, a chance to grow without limits. When he married Jenna, I kept my reservations quiet. She was ambitious, sharp-tongued, and made it clear from day one that she thought I was a relic of a less refined era. But I let it go again and again because Kyle looked happy, and that's what mattered to me. When they bought their house 6 years ago, Kyle told me they'd been denied by the bank for a full loan. Jenna's parents had already contributed toward their wedding, so I stepped in, no questions asked. I paid the down payment, and without ever asking for credit, I set up an automatic bank transfer that covered the mortgage, $2, 812.47 a month. I didn't want them to struggle. I didn't want my grandson, Caleb, to grow up without security. I did it in silence, assuming they'd appreciate it in their own time. But that time never came. I hadn't planned on visiting them for Christmas. I never did, really. They usually sent a picture or a thank you text after opening the gifts I mailed over. But this year, I felt the loneliness more than usual. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was hearing my neighbor's kids laughing through the walls. I decided to bake Mary's old fruitcake recipe and my famous chicken casserole and drive over unannounced, just to drop them off and say hello. I even wrapped a little car set for Caleb, one he'd been eyeing during my last visit. Their driveway was packed when I arrived. A full house. I parked down the street and walked through the brisk air, carrying the food and gift in both arms, a hopeful smile pulling at my face despite the nerves. The door opened slowly when I knocked. Jenna peeked out, her expression blank. She didn't say Merry Christmas, didn't open wider. Instead, she turned and called back inside, "Kyle, it's your dad." Her voice wasn't exactly rude, but there was no warmth in it either. Kyle came into view. He didn't look mad or happy, just surprised. He stepped halfway through the doorway and said, "I didn't think you'd actually come, Dad." There was a pause. He didn't step aside, didn't offer to take my coat or invite me in. Inside, I could hear music, people laughing, Caleb squealing about a new toy. The kind of warmth I had expected to be part of. I held up the casserole and fruitcake. Just thought I'd swing by, drop these off. Brought Caleb that toy car he wanted. I smiled through the growing lump in my throat. Kyle looked over his shoulder. "We've got Jenna's parents over and some friends. It's kind of full in there." Another pause. He didn't say, "Come in." I felt like a delivery guy. Not family. Not even a guest. Just a man on the porch with food nobody asked for. I nodded, keeping my smile up with everything I had. "No problem," I said. "Tell everyone Merry Christmas for me." He reached out, and took the dishes and the gift. "Thanks, Dad," he said, and then the door shut. Not slammed, just shut. Polite, cold, final. I stood there for a second before turning back toward the street, hearing the laughter continue behind me, as if nothing had happened. I drove home slowly. The radio was playing, "I'll Be Home for Christmas," and I laughed once, just one bitter breath out through my nose. Home. I parked in my driveway, took off my coat, and sat down at the kitchen table. The silence was so complete, it rang in my ears. I looked at the little tree I'd put up in the corner, half decorated. I looked at the wall where Mary's picture still hung. Then I turned on my laptop, pulled up the bank's website, and logged in. The scheduled payment to the mortgage company glared at me. Next installment, due January 2nd. That thought stuck like a splinter in my chest. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, remembering every single thing I'd done to help them build that life. It wasn't just the mortgage payments, though that alone totaled over $200,000 across 6 years. It was the broken water heater I replaced 2 winters ago when Kyle called me, panicked about the pipes. It was the new fridge they couldn't afford, the one I ordered and had delivered when Jenna's parents were in town so they could host properly. It was the insulation job I did on my knees in their attic, sweating like a dog while they went to a dinner party. It was every time I watched Caleb when their sitter bailed, and they didn't want to cancel brunch. I never asked for thanks. I didn't need a plaque. I just wanted to be seen as part of their circle, part of the home I helped keep standing. Instead, I was the outsider with a casserole, left on the porch like an Amazon package they didn't remember ordering. I opened a drawer in the kitchen and pulled out a manila envelope I kept there. It had copies of every payment I'd made for them, transfers, confirmation receipts, even a few handwritten notes from Kyle back when this all started, little scribbles that said, "Thanks, Dad. You're saving our butts." I hadn't gotten a note like that in 4 years, maybe 5. I looked at those notes and wondered when things shifted, when the gratitude disappeared and entitlement took its place. I remembered the last real conversation we had, almost a year ago, when Kyle called asking if I could front the cost of repainting the house before a neighborhood inspection. I said yes, of course I said yes. He didn't even say thank you that time, just sent me the invoice. Jenna sent me a picture of the finished paint job the next day, with a single emoji, a thumbs up. That was the last time she messaged me directly. Over time, they stopped asking how I was. Calls turned into texts. Then even texts became rare and always about something they needed. Never about me. Never about how I was holding up after Mary. Not even about how I was doing through the pandemic. Just requests, silent transactions with no warmth behind them. I was a resource, not a person. I set the envelope down and walked to the living room where the half-decorated tree still stood. I planned to finish it that evening after getting back from their place, maybe even bring Caleb over the next day to help hang the rest of the ornaments. I'd pulled out Mary's favorite glass icicles, the ones she always insisted go up last. They were still in their box. I didn't have the heart to hang them anymore. I sat down on the couch and stared at the tree, and the more I thought about everything, the dinners I wasn't invited to, the holidays where I got a text instead of visit, the way Jenna would never call me by name, only your dad, the more I realized how long I'd been holding on to hope that was never real. I wasn't family to them, not in the way family should be. I was invisible unless they needed something fixed or paid for. I thought of Caleb and how he looked at me during my last visit when I brought him a wooden airplane I made in the shed. He smiled so wide, asked me to show him how it flew, and for a moment, I felt that maybe he saw me differently. But then Jenna pulled him away, saying it was screen time now, not tinker time, and that was the end of it. They were reshaping him too, teaching him that grandpa was background noise, that I was not someone to be admired, just tolerated. I wondered what Mary would think of all this. I think she'd be heartbroken. Now, it was mostly quiet, retired folks like me, or younger couples who kept their curtains drawn. I hadn't felt part of it in a while, but today I felt even further removed, like I'd slipped out of frame in my own story. The bitterness from the night before had turned into something more precise, clarity. As I stepped back into my house and closed the door, I realized that everything I had assumed about my relationship with Kyle and Jenna had been rooted in fiction, not fact. For years, I had convinced myself that my role in their lives was valuable because I was dependable, because I provided, because I was always the one who said yes. But when I really thought about it, when I peeled back the layers of that illusion, I couldn't recall the last time they did something for me without a prompt. Not once had they invited me over without needing a babysitter or a fix. Not once had they remembered my birthday with more than a text or a store-bought card signed only with their names. Not once had Jenna spoken to me like I mattered beyond the perimeter of their needs. It stung worse than I wanted to admit. That morning, I went into my office, a small back room that still held Mary's favorite rocking chair and the shelves I'd built myself. I pulled open the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and took out the binder I had kept since the start of Kyle's marriage. It was the kind of binder most people would mistake for tax records, nothing more. But inside were printouts of every transaction I'd made to cover their mortgage, itemized receipts for the home improvements I'd funded, screenshots of texts confirming their requests, and even a few thank you emails from Kyle back in the early days. I flipped through it slowly, page by page, and what I saw wasn't generosity. It was a ledger of quiet exploitation. I had built their life one payment at a time while they built a wall between us. At some point, I had become less of a father and more of a financial institution with a last name. I remembered when Kyle called me 5 years ago, voice shaky with panic, saying he was about to lose the house unless someone co-signed. I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask for terms or repayment. I told him I'd cover the payments until he got his feet under him. That was supposed to be temporary, just 6 months. 6 months became a year, then 2. When I brought it up once, gently, Kyle said Jenna's new job wasn't as steady as they thought. Then it was the second baby plan that didn't happen. Then inflation. Then silence. And I let it happen. That was the part that hurt most. I let it all happen, thinking I was being noble. But really, I was being erased. Every page of that binder told the story of a man who believed too long in a version of family that didn't exist anymore. They used my kindness like a credit card with no limit, and I never once read the fine print. I thought about the way Jenna looked at me when I showed up unannounced on Christmas Eve, as if I were the disruption, the misstep, the blemish on their otherwise curated holiday evening. I wasn't Kyle's father in that moment. I was the outdated part of his life he didn't know how to throw away without feeling guilty. I put the binder on the desk and sat in silence for a long time. The sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked through the air like a soft reminder that time moves forward, whether you're ready or not. I stared at the wall, where Mary's embroidery still hung, reading, "Love is shown in the little things." She had stitched that in 1989 during a rough patch in our marriage, and it had stayed up ever since. I used to believe it with my whole heart. Now, I wasn't so sure. The little things, the food I dropped off, the repairs I made, the notes I sent, had never been enough to matter. They were tokens, not treasures. And as I thought more, the clarity sharpened into something like resolve. I hadn't just canceled a mortgage payment the night before. I had ended a lie. I had stopped feeding a version of fatherhood that only took from me and gave nothing back. That thought wasn't freeing. Not yet, but it was the first honest step I'd taken in years. I stood up and walked to the bookshelf, pulling down a photo album. Flipping through the pages, I saw pictures of Kyle as a boy, grinning in a treehouse I'd built, holding up a fish on our camping trip to Lake Conroe, sitting on Mary's lap at Thanksgiving. He had once looked at me like I was the whole world. When did that stop? When did I become a footnote in his life instead of a foundation? I didn't know. Maybe it wasn't one moment, but 1,000 small ones I missed, too busy trying to be helpful to notice I was being slowly pushed out. I closed the album and set it aside. My thoughts kept drifting back to the door that was never opened for me, to the faces that barely registered disappointment when I walked away. I wasn't angry in the typical sense. I didn't feel the burn of rage or the bite of bitterness. What I felt was a simmering ache, the kind that settles deep in your bones when you realize the people you love don't actually love you back in the way you always believed. That truth had hardened overnight into something undeniable. Then, just before lunch, my phone rang. I recognized the number instantly. Jenna. I stared at the screen for a moment, debating whether I should answer it all. The last time we spoke, months ago, it was to confirm a wire transfer for a new air conditioning unit. I answered anyway. Hello, I said, voice flat. Hi, Walter, she began, her tone sweet but taut, the kind of syrupy politeness that came laced with warning signs. So, Kyle told me you stopped by last night. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence stretch a little, just enough to make her squirm. She cleared her throat. It was just such bad timing. We had people over. His parents, my parents, and a few friends from Kyle's office. It was kind of a formal thing. Still, I said nothing. Then she added, You understand, right? I took a breath. No, I said simply. That word hung there, heavier than I intended, and I let it land. We just didn't expect you, she said quickly, like she had rehearsed it. And with everything going on, Caleb was overexcited. The kitchen was chaos. It wasn't the best environment for a surprise visit. I want to laugh. The idea that the man who paid for that very kitchen, was an inconvenience inside it felt too absurd a process. I brought food, I said. I brought gifts. I wasn't there to cause a scene. I just thought I'd see my grandson for a few minutes. She sighed, her voice dipping into that condescending tone she always slipped into when trying to sound sophisticated. Walter, I'm just going to be honest with you. Sometimes it's a little difficult having you around. Your energy, your mannerisms. You're a bit, how do I say this, intense. I blinked. Intense. Yes. You talk about the past a lot. You bring up Mary all the time, and sometimes it makes people uncomfortable. It brings the mood down, especially at family gatherings. For a moment, I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She wasn't just shutting the door in my face physically. She was rewriting my character, making me the problem. I was too much, too old, too out of place. Mary was my wife, I said, voice tighter now. She was Kyle's mother. Caleb's grandmother. She is part of every gathering, whether you like it or not. Jenna gave a short, exasperated breath. I'm not trying to fight, Walter. I'm just saying that sometimes we need to manage the atmosphere when we have guests. You could be a little heavy. You mean real? I asked. You mean not polished enough for your Instagram version of Christmas? She didn't answer. I could hear movement on her end, maybe walking into another room. I know you've been helping us, she said at last, but that doesn't mean you get to just show up whenever you want. There are boundaries, and this is one of them. That was it. That was the moment. The click. The breaking point. She had said what she really thought. That I was useful, but not welcome. That I was tolerated only as long as I didn't make anyone uncomfortable. As long as I stayed invisible. Well, Jenna, I said, suddenly calmer than I expected. I'm glad you brought that up, because starting this month, those helpful payments are going to stop. You don't have to worry about me crossing any boundaries anymore. Silence. Then wait, what? You heard me, I replied. I canceled the mortgage payments. Effective immediately. You and Kyle will need to make arrangements. I suggest you talk to your bank. She tried to laugh, but came out brittle. Walter, you can't be serious. Kyle's going to freak out. Kyle's a grown man, I said, with a job, a wife, and a child. He can figure it out. You're punishing us, she hissed, and now the sweetness was gone. You're doing this out of spite. No, I said, I'm doing this out of clarity. There's a difference. She stammered, we have responsibilities. That house was built on an understanding that I was too naive to define. I cut in. But now I understand. I'm not your backup plan anymore. Kyle won't forgive you, she warned. He'll cut you off. I paused, then said, you already did that. You just didn't send a memo. I ended the call before she could reply, hand trembling slightly as I placed the phone down. My heart pounded, but not with fear, with certainty. And yet, even with that newfound resolve, there was a strange hollowness in my chest, like pulling out a splinter and still feeling the sting long after it's gone. I knew I had done what needed to be done, but cutting the cord after 6 years of monthly sacrifice didn't come without its own sting. The echo of Jenna's voice still played in my head, especially that line. You're doing this out of spite. No, I thought again and again. This isn't spite. This is truth. This is clarity. And clarity demands action. I walked into my study, pulled out that binder again, and laid it flat across the desk. Each page told a chapter of my silence. Payments on time. Emergency fund transfers. Gift receipts I'd saved to claim nothing on taxes, but to remind myself of how far I'd gone to carry their burdens. All those pages had names, dates, dollar amounts, but no gratitude attached to them. That's when I decided to put it to bed properly. I opened my laptop and went straight to my online banking portal. I checked again, just to make sure. The automatic monthly payment to their mortgage lender was gone, but there were more payments I hadn't thought of in a while. The water softener I'd set up through my own account. The pest control plan I'd enrolled them in when Jenna complained about ants. The landscaping service I paid quarterly because Kyle said his weekends were too busy to mow. I canceled them all one by one. Each confirmation email pinged into my inbox like a bell tolling the end of something sacred. At first, my hands were steady, then they began to tremble, not from uncertainty, but from the emotional load that came with each severed tie. This wasn't just about cutting off money. This was about rewriting my role in their lives, removing the invisible strings I'd tied around their comfort so tightly that I had forgotten how to breathe without tension. I opened a blank document and began to type, not an email, but a letter. A letter to myself. A simple declaration of what I would no longer tolerate. I'm not an emergency fund. I'm not a silent partner in a life I'm excluded from. I'm not just useful. I am worthy. And I will no longer trade my peace for proximity to people who do not want me present. I read it aloud once, then saved it. I didn't need to send it. It was mine. The next step came without planning. I found myself picking up the phone again, this time dialing the number of my lawyer, Frank Mendelson, a man I hadn't spoken to in a couple of years since finalizing Mary's will. When he answered, his voice was the same calm gravel I remembered. Walter? Well, this is a surprise. Everything okay? It will be, I said. I need to make some changes to my will. Frank paused a beat before saying, all right, you want to schedule something? No, I want to do it now. I'm ready. I heard the scratch of his pen as he opened his notebook. Go ahead. I took a deep breath. Remove Kyle and Jenna from the estate. I'm keeping a trust for Caleb. Only Caleb. And I want a clause in there to protect it until he turns 25. No access for the parents. No loopholes. If I'm gone, I want him to have something, but not at the cost of letting them use it to their advantage. Frank whistled lightly. Understood. This is permanent. Permanent, I said, not flinching. All right then, I'll draw it up. We'll get it notarized next week. I thanked him, hung up, and sat for a moment in silence. That silence felt different now. Not empty, but clean. Not lonely, but free. I had spent so many years letting guilt dictate my generosity, letting fear of being forgotten push me into deeper and deeper sacrifice. But now, I felt something stronger rising in its place: self-respect. I got up, walked into the living room, and looked at that half-decorated Christmas tree again. I picked up the glass icicles, Mary's favorite, and hung them one by one, not because I had anyone coming over to see them, but because I wanted them there. For me, for her, for the promise I made to myself that day. Later, I sat by the window as the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the living room floor. My phone remained quiet. No calls from Kyle. No frantic text from Jenna. And that told me everything I needed to know. Had they seen the payment stop? Probably. Had they realized what it meant? Almost certainly. But still, no one reached out. The silence wasn't confusion. But nothing came. The silence, I realized, wasn't hesitation. It was entitlement. They were waiting. Waiting for me to change my mind. Waiting for the money to start flowing again. Waiting for the old man to come to his senses and realize that cutting them off was somehow irrational or cruel. That expectation made me angrier than I had anticipated. I had lived my entire life under the assumption that generosity bred gratitude, but Kyle and Jenna had turned it into a contract of submission. And now, because I had finally withdrawn from their theater of control, they assumed I'd come crawling back to be cast again in my role of silent benefactor. They had no idea the play was over. I was done, but I wasn't done quietly. On the third day after the call with Jenna, I received a text message from her, short and curt. "Could you pick up my parents from the airport Friday at 2:30 p.m.? Kyle's stuck at work, and I'm with Caleb at the dentist." That was it. No greeting, no request, just an instruction like I was some low-rent chauffeur on call whenever they needed a ride. I stared at the message, read it twice, then 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't believe it. After everything, this was how they reached out? Not a question, not even an acknowledgement of our last conversation, just a command, a task, another expectation. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, just letting it go unanswered. But something in me twisted, a knot of quiet fury that had been tightening for years and had now found its edge. I didn't want to ignore it. I wanted to answer it, and I wanted them to feel what it meant to be disregarded. So I replied simply, "Sure." No punctuation, no elaboration, just the word. I knew they would take it as compliance, as proof the old man had been again. That was exactly what I wanted, because I had no intention of going to that airport. Friday came, cold and gray, the kind of day that made your bones ache even with a scarf and coat. I woke up early, had breakfast, then went out to my workshop and worked on an old cabinet I'd been restoring. Around noon, I packed a thermos of coffee and drove down to the lake an hour out of town, where Mary and he used to go when we needed to escape everything. I sat on a bench by the water, sipping coffee, watching ducks glide across the surface, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Jenna's parents were undoubtedly stepping off their flight, scanning the crowd from my face. I imagined them standing by the baggage claim, phones in hand, waiting. 5 minutes turned to 15, then 30, then an hour. Perhaps they called Jenna. Perhaps Jenna called Kyle. And then Kyle, in his rising frustration, would try me. My phone buzzed just after 3. I didn't answer. It buzzed again, then again. I let it ring out, each vibration feeling like a victory I hadn't known I needed. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to explain. I just needed them to wait. The way I'd waited. Waited for thank yous that never came, for invitations that were never sent, for warmth that was always withheld. I stayed by the lake for another hour, took a few pictures of the sky, then headed home. My voicemail was full by the time I returned. First Jenna, irritated. Then Kyle, angry. Then Jenna again, this time with that brittle, performative concern she wore like cheap perfume when things didn't go her way. They all sounded shocked, indignant, insulted. And that told me exactly what I needed to know. They hadn't learned a thing. They still believed the world revolved around them, that I was a planet in their orbit, dependent on their approval to shine. But that day proved otherwise. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel petty. I felt powerful. Because this wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. The next day, I finally listened to the voicemails. One stood out, Jenna's father. Walter, this is Henry. We waited an hour and a half at Terminal C. No word, no explanation. I don't know what's going on, but this was highly unprofessional. But on the fourth day, just as I was returning from the grocery store, the inevitable happened. Kyle called. The screen lit up with his name, and I let it ring once, twice, just long enough to assert control. Then I answered with a calm, hello. His voice was tight, clipped, restrained like he was trying not to raise it, but couldn't quite help the undertone. Why didn't you pick up Jenna's parents? I let a moment of silence stretch between us before replying. I had plans. Plans? He repeated, disbelief crackling through the phone. You said you'd go. No. I corrected. I said sure. I didn't say I promised. And you didn't ask. You told me. His breath hitched, clearly not expecting the pushback. You left two senior citizens stranded at the airport, Dad. Do you know how humiliating that was for us? I didn't even blink. Probably about as humiliating as being left standing on your porch Christmas Eve with a casserole in hand and no invitation inside. He fell quiet, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. I waited. When he spoke again, the edge in his voice had dulled slightly, replaced by something more controlled, but just as condescending. Look, we didn't mean for things to go this way. Jenna and I are under a lot of stress, and the holiday got away from us. That's not an excuse, but you have to understand, no, I cut him off. I don't have to understand anything anymore. That silence again. Then, cautiously, are you still covering the house payment? There it was. The real reason for the call. Not concern, not regret, just the mortgage. Always the money. No, I said flatly. I canceled it last week, and all the other payments too. The house, the pest control, the landscaping, the subscriptions. I stopped everything. Jesus, Dad, he snapped, and now the real Kyle came out, the one who couldn't hide his disappointment when things didn't go his way. You can't just pull the rug out like that. We have a system. No, I said again, evenly, you had a system. I was the system. You treated me like a bank without terms, a handyman without a clock, a family member only when it was convenient. That system's broken now. We counted on you, he said, and for a second, I almost heard something real in his voice, something human. But it vanished just as quickly as it appeared. You can't just back out after 6 years. You should have given us time to adjust. I laughed softly, shaking my head though he couldn't see it. I gave you 6 years, Kyle. 6 years to find your feet, to take over, to show a shred of gratitude. And instead, you doubled down on using me. Do you even know what a thank you sounds like anymore? This isn't fair, he said. You're acting like we're villains. You are. I replied, not angrily, but with the quiet weight of truth. You became villains to your own father, and you didn't even notice it happening. That was when he hung up. No goodbye, no apology, just a deadline. I stood there in my kitchen, groceries still in the bag, feeling like the house had shifted under me in a way that finally aligned with reality. No more delusion. No more clinging to a family that only saw me in terms of transactions. That same evening, I took things further. I logged into the home insurance account, the one I'd kept in my name to secure a better rate, and I initiated the policy transfer. It required Kyle's signature, of course, but the notice would go out regardless. Then I called the local tax assessor's office and ensured that the property tax notifications would now go to their address only. No more letters piling up in my mailbox that reminded me of responsibilities that weren't mine. I even called the HOA and removed my contact from their emergency list. Let Kyle get those fine-laden letters about trash bins and fence repairs. Let Jenna deal with a broken pipe at midnight. Let them manage what I had been shielding them from for years. And I didn't stop there. I printed out a summary of all payments I'd made, month by month, year by year, complete with totals and annotations. It was meticulous, unemotional, damning. I sealed it in a manila envelope and drove it over to their house just after dusk. I didn't knock. What I felt, oddly enough, was stillness. A pure, unfamiliar kind of quiet that filled every inch of me. Not silence born of rejection or abandonment, but one forged from choice. My choice. The first real choice I had made for myself in years. Back home, I kicked off my boots, poured myself a glass of water, and stared at the Christmas tree again. The lights blinked rhythmically, unaware of the storm they had quietly survived. I reached into the box where I kept Mary's ornaments, pulled out the last two she had ever bought before she passed, and hung them carefully, one shaped like a small wooden cabin, the other a silver dove. It wasn't an act of nostalgia. It was a declaration. My life, my home, my memories, they mattered too. And I wasn't going to keep them in storage just because I had no audience. I took the next few days to rebuild the parts of myself I had neglected, not with sweeping changes or dramatic gestures, but with small, deliberate acts. I cleaned out the garage, finally sorting through the tools and parts that had been gathering dust. I dusted off the old record player Mary and I used to dance to and let it play through every song we had labeled ours. I even repainted the shed, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to see something new in my space, something that reflected the transformation I was finally stepping into. During those days, I didn't check my phone often. When I did, I saw more messages from Kyle, each one more desperate than the last. The tone had shifted. First anger, then guilt tripping, then outright begging. Dad, please, we're in a hole here. The lender called us. This is serious. Can't we talk? But we had already talked. I had spent 6 years talking in actions. Every payment, every favor, every silence after dismissal was a conversation they ignored. Now, they wanted words, but I had run out. What they really wanted wasn't reconciliation. It was restoration of their comfort. They missed the convenience I brought, not the man I was. That difference was everything. On the 5th morning, I went to the diner down the street, the one Mary used to love because it had those tiny jukeboxes at each booth. I ordered pancakes, bacon, and black coffee. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, while reading the newspaper front to back like I used to before everything became about digital screens and never-ending requests. Halfway through my meal, the waitress, a kind woman named Lori I'd known for years, stopped by and smiled. "You seem lighter," she said. "Something good happened?" I thought for a second, then replied, "No, but something bad stopped." She laughed, but I meant it. Cutting off Kyle and Jenna hadn't fixed my life, but it had stopped the constant leak that drained me without pause. It had given me a chance to notice things again. The warmth of a sunny window, the comfort of familiar music, the freedom of a morning that wasn't scheduled around someone else's needs. I didn't hate my son. I didn't even hate Jenna, for all her smug entitlement and icy disdain. But I pitied them. They had grown so accustomed to measuring worth in what could be taken that they had forgotten how to give. They had mistaken provision for love and dependency for closeness. And in doing so, they had not only lost a benefactor, they had lost a father. I spent that afternoon at the local rec center where I signed up for a woodworking class. I hadn't taken one since my 40s, back when Kyle used to sit beside me with sawdust in his hair and wonder in his eyes. I was the oldest in the class now by at least 20 years, but that didn't matter. I wasn't there to compete. I was there to build again, not for someone else, but for me. That evening, I turned my phone off. I unplugged it entirely and left it on the kitchen counter while I cooked dinner. A full meal, just for myself, stuffed chicken breasts, mashed potatoes with garlic and chives, roasted carrots. I plated it neatly, lit a candle for ambience, and ate at the table like I had company. Because I did. I had me. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. I could still hear Kyle's last voicemail in my head. This is going to destroy our credit. Do you even care? It rang like a bell of everything they had reduced me to. Not Dad, not Walter, just credit, just backup, just invisible support until it disappeared. And now that it had, they were adrift, not because they'd been abandoned, but because they'd never learned to sail on their own. That was not my failure anymore. That was their reckoning. That weekend, I drove out to the cemetery where Mary was buried. I brought fresh flowers, her favorite lilies, and a thermos of coffee. I sat on the bench beside her plot and talked. Not out loud, not in whispers, but in my heart. I told her everything. 2 weeks after I'd visited Mary's grave, a thick white envelope showed up in my mailbox, addressed in Kyle's handwriting. For a moment, I considered tossing it directly in the trash, but curiosity got the better of me. I took it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened it. Inside was a letter, 3 pages front and back, and a copy of something official looking. I read the letter first. It started off just like I expected. Excuses, rationalizations, thin veils of guilt dressed up as sincerity. Dad, I know you're hurt. I know things haven't been easy. I should have called. We should have treated you better. Jenna feels terrible too. I nearly laughed. Jenna feeling terrible was about as believable as a snowstorm in July. But I kept reading. The tone shifted about halfway through. The letter became less about apology and more about desperation. We're being audited, Kyle wrote. Apparently, the bank flagged a series of irregular transactions. When they dug deeper, they found that most of the mortgage payments weren't coming from our accounts. Now, they're asking questions. They think there might be fraud involved. Jenna's freaking out. She didn't know you were paying it through your own name. It's complicated. We didn't think it would ever become a problem. I sat back in my chair, letting the words sink in. Fraud? I had always paid the bills directly, legally, with records. But Kyle and Jenna had clearly pretended to others that they were paying their own way. Maybe they claimed the tax deductions. Maybe they misrepresented their income to qualify for credit. Whatever they'd done, my generosity had been absorbed into a lie they never thought would surface. And now it was surfacing. I opened the second document. It was a formal notice from their bank, citing discrepancies in their financial history and requesting a meeting to discuss repayment structures and supporting documentation. My name was listed 3 times as the origin of key transfers. I wasn't in trouble. I'd done everything by the book, but they were. Very much so. And they were turning to me to help clean up the mess they made from the help I had given. It was the most ironic twist of all. My kindness, used without acknowledgement, had become their undoing. I took the letter and the bank notice and slid them back into the envelope. I didn't need time to think. I already knew my answer. That afternoon, I made an appointment with my lawyer Frank again. We sat in his wood-paneled office, the fireplace crackling faintly behind him. I slid the documents across the table. Do I need to respond? I asked. He scanned the papers, nodding slowly. Not legally. You were generous, not negligent. If they told the bank they were paying and used your payments to prove financial stability, that's on them. You're clean. So what do? I asked. Frank looked up. You walk away. You've done enough. You think they'll come after me publicly? I asked. He shrugged. They might try to spin it, make you look cold, paint themselves as victims. But you've got 6 years of records and a clean trail. And frankly, anyone who knows you won't believe their story anyway. That was enough for me. I went home, took the envelope, and placed it in the same binder that had once held every proof of the love I gave freely. That binder now told a different story, a story of manipulation, of financial misuse, of entitlement left unchecked. But most importantly, it told the truth. The next morning, I received a phone call. Not for Kyle this time, but from Jenna. I let it ring. She called again. I let that ring too. On the third attempt, she left a voicemail. Her voice was strained, clipped. "Walter, this is Jenna. We need to talk. Things are messy. Look, I know we didn't always handle things the right way, but this is serious. Please don't let your silence ruin everything we've built." I played the message back twice, then deleted it, because what they'd built wasn't mine to preserve. They had built it on lies, on omission, on the illusion of independence propped up by my unseen hand. And now that hand was gone, I spent the rest of the day cleaning out the closet in the guest room, what used to be Caleb's playroom whenever they visited. I found a half-deflated football, a plastic dinosaur, and a drawing he'd made that said, "Grandpa is my hero." I kept the drawing, threw out the rest, not because I didn't care about Caleb, but because I wouldn't let their chaos spill into my home anymore. If I ever saw my grandson again, it would be on my terms. I'd still keep the trust one set up for him, but I'd also be visiting Frank next week to add a guardian clause. If Kyle or Jenna try to access those funds early, they'd hit a legal wall so high it'd make their current audit look like a parking ticket. The morning after I deleted Jenna's voicemail, the sky was the color of slate, heavy with clouds but calm, as if the world had decided to exhale along with me. The winter wind had softened, and for the first time in weeks, I felt no tension in my shoulders, no weight pressing down on my chest. I stood at the window, watching the frost begin to melt from the corners of the lawn, and I knew with absolute certainty the storm had passed. Not just the audit or the confrontation or the endless cycle of being needed but never appreciated, but the larger storm. The storm of confusion, of longing, of believing that my worth was measured only by what I gave. That belief was gone now, unraveled in the quiet aftermath of watching those I had loved use that love as a tool, or worse, as a weapon. I made breakfast slowly, eggs, toast, a bit of sausage. I brewed fresh coffee and poured it into my favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle Mary refused to throw away. "Imperfection makes it yours," she used to say. I smiled at that, the memory of her words settling over me like a warm blanket. I sat down at the table and opened the newspaper, same as I had every morning, but this time I wasn't waiting for my phone to ring. I wasn't bracing for a crisis. There was no emergency to manage, no guilt trip to sidestep, just peace. And that peace, I realized, wasn't an accident. It was a choice, a boundary I had drawn, a life I had reclaimed. A week later, I received a holiday card in the mail. It was postmarked 3 days before Jenna's voicemail, which meant it had been sent before they realized how deep they were in trouble. The front was embossed with gold foil and read, "Wishing you peace and joy this holiday season." Inside, scrawled in Jenna's neat, curated handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for everything this year. We couldn't have done it without you. Love, Kyle, Jenna, and Caleb." There was no apology, no reflection, just more proof that gratitude, to them, was an afterthought, a formality, something they mailed in advance, assuming the status quo would remain. I placed the card on the table, stared at it for a moment, then dropped it into the trash without a second thought. That same afternoon, I went to the rec center and attended my third woodworking class. I was in the middle of carving the leg of a small end table, my hands steady and precise, when a young man in his 20s turned to me and said, "You've got a good eye for detail. You do this a lot." I chuckled. "Used to. Took a break for a few decades. Now I'm catching up." He smiled. "Well, you've still got it." And I thanked him, not because I needed the validation, but because it felt good to be seen without strings attached. That evening, I took a walk through the neighborhood, something I hadn't done in years. I nodded at the kids on bicycles, waved at the couple decorating their porch, and even stopped to pet a neighbor's golden retriever. It was simple, uneventful, beautiful. I was no longer walking through my life on autopilot, distracted by who might need me next. I was present, free. When I got home, I pulled out the trust paperwork for Caleb one last time. I updated a few clauses to ensure its longevity, added a note that would one day be shared with him directly, a note explaining who I was, who his father had been, and why the money was his alone. I didn't know if I'd live long enough to see him grow into the man I hoped he'd be. But I knew that if he ever reached for the truth, it would be there, written in my own words, without shame or bitterness. Only love. A week later, I received an invitation in the mail to a neighborhood potluck. I hadn't been to one in years, always finding an excuse, too tired, too busy, too obligated elsewhere. But this time, I marked it on the calendar. I even baked Mary's famous sweet potato pie, the recipe still smudged with her handwriting. When I arrived at the potluck, a few people were surprised to see me. "We didn't know you still came to these," one woman said. "I do now," I replied with a smile. And just like that, I was no longer the man in the background. I was part of something again, not because I was needed, but because I wanted to be. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the confrontation, the unraveling, and finally, the choice to step away. I thought about Kyle, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt sadness, yes, but also distance. Safe, necessary distance. He had made his choices. So had I. And that meant something. It meant healing. It meant I had taken the pieces of myself scattered across years of quiet suffering and slowly, carefully reassembled them into someone whole. I closed my eyes, the winter wind humming softly outside, and thought of Mary. I imagined her smile, the way she used to hum while folding laundry, the soft pat of her hand on mine when words weren't enough. "I did it, Mary," I whispered into the dark. I found my way back, and in the silence that followed, I felt her with me, not as a ghost or a memory, but as part of the strength I had carried all along. I had lost so much, but I had not lost myself, and in that truth, I had finally found peace. The end. If you've made it all the way through my story, thank you, truly. It wasn't easy reliving these moments. But if sharing them helps even one person realize their worth or reconsider the weight they carry for others, then it's worth every word. If you felt something, anger, shock, maybe even a little hope, go ahead and tap that like button and subscribe. I've got more stories to tell, and I'd be glad to have you along for the ride. Now I'm curious, what part of this story hit home for you the most? Was it when I stood alone on that porch with a pie in my hands? Or maybe the moment I finally said no, really meant it, and never looked back? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my shoes? And just out of curiosity, where in the world are you watching from? Go on, I'll be reading.